All right.
How does it feel to know that no matter how good you did on that quiz, your grade in this class just came down?
Is that when you were perfect up until now?
No, he was perfect either way, but he just had a higher score.
Because from his last quiz, 140 on 140.
Oh,
120 actually brings his grade down.
You can't win.
Just saying.
Yeah, I hadn't thought of that.
That's the bad thing about doing so well. You can't bring it up.
I have placed a verse on the screen that is considered probably one of the primary go-to passages in Scripture to justify a holistic approach to mission. So I'm going to help you fill in these notes here, but we're going to spend quite a bit of time looking at this passage. And we really need to take in the context as we do so. Okay, so if I remember correctly,
Did you start the recording?
I did start the recording, yes, thank you. Thank you, I appreciate the reminder. All right, so we are ready for the two key passages on page 5, correct? And one of them, actually, these two are both connected. I mean, the passage in Luke 4:18, which is number 2, actually is a quotation of this passage in Isaiah that Jesus makes in the synagogue in Nazareth. Okay, so number 1 is Isaiah 61, 1 and 2. Couple things here before I come back to the verse itself. First of all, letter A is the link with Leviticus 25. Now, we're not going to take time to go there just because we really don't have it. But Leviticus 25 is the institution of what we often refer to as the year of Jubilee. Have you guys studied that in other classes? Can somebody tell me what the year of Jubilee was? What was it about?
Wasn't every 50th year, the Jewish community would kind of, like, all debts everywhere would be completely released. Everything would be like a brand new slate. Land would be given back to everyone. It'd be this huge celebration for an entire year.
Mm-hmm. Yes. It was similar to the sabbatical year, which was every 7 years, but more inclusive. In other words, the sabbatical year was basically, every 7th year was basically intended to rest the land. But the year of Jubilee was more inclusive than that. Any slaves, whether they were slaves in the, strictest sense of the word, or whether they were people who had indentured themselves as slaves in order to pay off a debt, everything was free. So, in theory, okay, this year was not calculated by it was calculated nationally. It was a nationally understood year. So in theory, if I became an indentured servant to somebody to pay off a $500,000 debt that I owed, and I did that in year 49, year 50, I'd be released. So you have to understand that people who negotiated this type of thing had to keep in mind where they were on the clock. On the calendar. Make sense? So the year of Jubilee was intended to be a year where everything was restored to the way it was before. If somebody had given away land, the land had to be returned because God did not want any one of the 12 tribes to play monopoly and end up swallowing up everybody else's land. And one of the ways to avoid that was every 50 years, whatever land was taken from a family or tribe was returned, so that the original division of the land in the days of Joshua could remain. Interesting how that works. So there are some similarities in the way that this passage is stated and what happened in the year of Jubilee. Okay, and so just to keep that in mind, and every time you read about feast days and things like that in the Old Testament, there's usually something in the future that's typifying, right? So what would the year of Jubilee actually be anticipating in the future?
I think the kingdom, when the land is returned to Israel, the Messiah comes, sets up a new kingdom, and restores all those who are poor and oppressed.
Absolutely. Yes. Now, when that was given back in Leviticus in the days of Moses, there was no kingdom, right? The kingdom didn't come until Saul, and then David, was the one that received the Davidic covenant. And that's like 400 years later. But God was already embedding in the Mosaic law something that would actually eventually be fulfilled in the kingdom. When, as you mentioned, Caleb, Israel would finally receive the land that was promised in the Abrahamic covenant, okay, and the restoration of all things. So, why is that important here? Because the language of this passage reflects some of the language. Notice, good news to the poor, bind up the brokenhearted, proclaim liberty to the captives, opening the prison to those who are bound, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor and the day of vengeance of our God. That language reflects the tenets of the year of Jubilee, okay, when all would be restored, which means that when Isaiah wrote this, he was talking about something a whole lot bigger than economic poverty, or people who are actually in jail or something like that. He was referring to something nationally that was going to take place. And in addition to that, we don't have time today, but if you go back and read the last several chapters of Isaiah, you'll see that the kingdom becomes a theme in all of those. Okay? Isaiah winds up his book at the very end. The end of his prophecy really draws the attention of the reader to the coming kingdom. All right. And so all these passages feed into that in one way or another. Does that make sense? I just want you to see that there's a passage that is much more than just local, temporal poverty and illness and captivity and things like that. All right. Now, why is it important to look at the Lucan passage? Because Jesus does something very interesting when he quotes this passage, and I think you probably already know what that is. Well, I'll just jump ahead for a second. When Jesus quoted this passage in the synagogue in Nazareth, what did he do that was interesting in relation to this passage?
You omitted the part about vengeance,
Yeah,
the day of the Lord.
right. Probably this was the assigned reading for that day. I can't prove it, but it was very typical for synagogues, and even today, many synagogues have a reading rotation. So whoever is invited or appointed to read for that day reads the passage for that day. Okay? And it's very possible that in God's providence, that was the passage that was on the rotation when Jesus was invited to give a word at at that synagogue service. So, but when he reads it, he ends at the year of the Lord's favor. And Luke very definitively says he closed the book. So it's very, very definitive. It's an important statement. Why did he close the book after making mention of the year of the Lord's favor?
Because the last part is like connected to another thing.
It's connected to what?
To another thing.
One other thing, you're right.
So like he was saying that like this has been what's the word? So like that had happened until that point.
Okay.
And like the other part hadn't happened yet.
And when would it happen?
Future.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good safe answer. You're right. Okay. Okay, what is the year of the Lord's favor referring to? Let's take that first part of it. He quoted that part. What is the year of the Lord's favor? Is it an actual year? No. Remember, when Jesus closed the book, he said, today, this is being fulfilled in your presence. And why did they get upset? Because they recognized this as a messianic passage. Notice the Spirit of the Lord. The Spirit of the Lord is one of the features, if I can use that word, of the messianic era, the last days. Okay? The year of the Lord's favor is the first coming of Jesus Christ. It's the first advent. The day of the Lord's vengeance, or the vengeance of our God, is a reference to the second coming. Think about it. The first coming of Jesus emphasized the grace of God, the favor of God, in offering salvation to his people. He came to provide that salvation. But when he comes back the second time, he's coming back to judge his enemies and establish his kingdom. He comes as the lamb the first time, he comes as the Lion of Judah the second time, right? In the book of Revelation, you see both of those expressions. And so, and you say, are we stretching that by seeing two advents here? No, it's common in the Old Testament. Isaiah, same book, Isaiah 9. Okay, unto us a child is born, unto us a son is given. Next statement is, the government will be on his shoulders. Isaiah says that as if it was all happening at once. Child is born, he grows up, government's on his shoulders. But because the church is a mystery in the Old Testament and two comings are a mystery, they don't perceive that. Okay? Zechariah does the same thing. In Zechariah 12, he talks about smiting the shepherd and the sheep will scatter. That was fulfilled when Jesus was arrested. And then the very next verses after that talk about the victory, the tribulation period, the struggles and tribulation. So Jesus intentionally leaves out the second part because he is proclaiming that he's the one who's coming to fulfill this first part, even though they don't get it at the time. Of course, they reject him and they end up trying to get rid of him. Okay, now why all this? Because this is a passage that is commonly used in missions to say that this is how we should do missions. Our purpose in missions is to help the poor, okay? It's to help those who are hurt or, brokenhearted, those who are down and out, okay? And then proclaim liberty to captives, people literally in captives, like in oppressive governments where they are actually prisoners in their own country. All right, and so on and so forth. Okay, and so what I'm trying to do is create a context for you to help you to see the short-sightedness of this application of that approach to missions. All right, am I making sense? Do you have questions about that? Do you see something different? It's very important. The emphasis on the word poor here is really important. So let's take a look. Okay. The letter B. You don't have to know Hebrew for this. I just threw the word in there because it's the main word. That's the word letter B for poor. Now, is that going to help us figure out what kind of poverty he's talking about? The answer is no. Why? Because number one there, literally, this word poor can mean life circumstances. So the blank there is life circumstances. But also the same word, number two, figuratively, can mean a state of mind, something that's non-material, right? Immaterial. Now, do we do that with our word poor? Sure. I can say, if you got a poor grade on this quiz, well, I'm not talking about money, I'm talking about your score, right? Or I can say, yeah, she's been in poor health for quite a while, okay? Or I can say, college students are poor. Now you think, oh, now he's talking economically. See, so we do the same thing with English. And the fact is, both the Hebrew and the Greek words for poor can be understood either way. So the meaning, the dictionary meaning of the word itself doesn't answer the question. That's why I took the time to look at the context, how this fits into the greater Old Testament picture, why Jesus approached the way he did. Okay, and so this is very, very important. All right, the letter C. So the context of chapter 61. And I've already made mention of this. The first blank there, C, is context of chapter 61. Number one, it anticipates the Messianic kingdom. And again, I've tried to show you that not only in the context of this chapter, but looking at the surrounding chapters. It's all about what's coming. Okay? Number two, the word poor is associated with the brokenhearted, captives, prisoners, and mourners. Poor here must be more than economic. Okay? We would be robbing this text of its richness to reduce the word poor here to those who are economically or socially poor. It's it has to be more than that. God, through the prophet Isaiah, saw the nation of Israel as poor. Okay, we're going to look at another passage in Revelation later that kind of reflects the same idea. But you're really robbing the passage of much of its richness to say that this is just about feeding the poor and or giving money to the poor or improving lifestyles. Jesus would have been wasting his time in that passage in the synagogue had that been its meaning. It has to be more than that. Now, can it include economic poverty? Yeah, but that's not the essence of it. All right. The number 3, Delitzsch and Bach, these are commentators, all right? They see it as spiritual poverty. That doesn't prove anything, but I'm just saying that these guys are well-known and respected theologians. Neither one of them would be premillennial, I don't think. I'm not sure about Bach, but they do understand this nonetheless as spiritual poverty. And I think that's, in fact, the same Jesus that proclaimed that in the synagogue got up on the mount and he in the Sermon on the Mount, and he begins it by saying what? What's the first thing that comes out of his mouth?
Blessed are the poor.
And what kind of poor? Blessed are the poor in spirit. So the very beginning of the Sermon on the Mount, it makes mention of the poor, but very specifically a spiritual poverty and not an economic one. Blessed are the poor in spirit. So anyway, there are lots of passages like that. Okay, so Luke 4:18. Let's go to number 2 there. Luke 4:18 is the passage he quotes, and he sits down without completing the verse. In fact, it's very possible that his reading assignment for that day was the entire chapter. Remember, chapter divisions didn't exist back then; they didn't come till later. But it's possible that, I mean, I would say it's probably unlikely that he was just given 2 verses to read, or the equivalent of 2 verses. More likely was the extended passage, but he reads just that much and stops and says, "This is being fulfilled today." Let's see. So anyway, I can't prove that, but it just makes sense. Letter A, then, the Greek word here is also the word poor. So the word there in parentheses is poor. And then there's some helpful, and again, like I said before, it can mean either one, just like the Hebrew. So helpful references. Matthew 5:3 is the one we just quoted from the Sermon on the Mount. Poor in spirit is the blank there. Poor in spirit. And there's no doubt about that. Jesus makes that clear. He qualifies it very specifically. In Luke 21, there are actually 2 different words that are used. Let's just take a look there real quick. Take a look at Luke chapter 21. You all know this story very well. The woman putting her coins in, right? And he saw a poor widow. And the word there is the word that's actually on the in the notes, that the first one in verse 2 there. And then he says, "Truly I say to you, this poor woman put in more than them all." And there he uses a different word. Maybe the reason he does that is because he's calling attention in the second, in verse 3, more to her spiritual poverty. I don't know. I can't prove that, but anyway. And then number 3, in Matthew 26, Jesus envisions something greater than giving to the economically poor. That's where the woman breaks the alabaster box and Judas speaks up and says, "Hey, that could have been sold and all the money could have been given to the poor," which he didn't care about anyway. And Jesus, how does Jesus respond? What does he say? Remember?
The poor you have with me always.
Yeah.
Me you don't have with me.
Right. Now, is Jesus despising the poor when he says that? Is he making light of them? No. But he's calling attention to something that is a priority, and that is spiritual poverty. Okay? And so that's important to keep in mind. Nowhere does the Bible despise the poor. In fact, James chides the richer believers in the church that you have despised the poor. We're not talking about Jesus despising the poor, but we are talking about him placing a higher premium on spiritual poverty like he does in the Sermon on the Mount. Okay? Just trying to shape your thinking a little bit on this. Then Revelation, what chapter did I put in your notes there?
3.
Okay, I did correct it. All right. Revelation 3 is the church of Laodicea. He says to them, you think you're rich, but actually you're poor, remember? And it's very clear there that the poverty he's talking about is spiritual poverty, because economically they were pretty affluent. But he says, you think you're rich, but in actuality you're poor, you're naked, you're destitute. Okay? So a couple of conclusions. One, you're not going to solve the issue based on the dictionary definition of the word poor. English, Portuguese, Hebrew, Greek, you name it. Okay, I don't know about French. Does French have a separate word for economic poverty than it does for other kinds of poverty? Or am I in over your head there?
I really only know economic poverty, so
Okay.
I don't know if there is a difference.
That's fine.
I know economic poverty very well.
Okay, so, and then number 2, the context. Don't forget the context. How does Isaiah 61 fit in the prophecy? How does it relate to other passages that sound similar, like the year of Jubilee, things like that? And why did Jesus stop what he did? Okay, so do you have questions about that? Okay. Now let's just look at something very practical. Do you think, in light of all of this, do you think it's okay for missionaries going to, let's just use this illustration, missionaries going to third world countries or economically, do you think it's okay for you to invest economically to help with those who are poor, economically poor? You think it's okay? All right. Why would you say that? Why do you think it's all right?
I would say if you're doing it in the right way, and there are wrong ways to do it. You see in John chapter 6, Jesus, I'm not saying he did it in the wrong way, but Jesus gave bread to all the people, but then they came back only wanting that bread and not wanting the true message he was proclaiming to them. But recognizing that Jesus also came to heal, to show that physical love, to demonstrate that his love of those people is genuine, so that when you give the message, they understand, oh, he's not just trying to gain converts so he can bolster his reputation.
Mm-hmm.
This person is actually concerned for my well-being, because they've shown that physically, so I can trust that they're concerned spiritually as well.
Okay. All right, good. You raise your hand too?
Kind of, not really.
Okay. All right. Does everybody agree with that? Anybody want to add, subtract, multiply, divide? I think you're on the right track. I think you're right. There are some who do not give any, they believe it's just better not to give any kind of material aid to people they're ministering to in other countries, because they believe that it will attract people to your ministry for the wrong reason. Okay, but I would ask a couple of questions. One, did Jesus have to deal with that in his ministry? Look at John 6. He says, you come to me because I gave you bread. They attracted people for the wrong reasons. Okay, so the fact that that happens doesn't necessarily mean that it's wrong to help people. Number 2, and this isn't in the notes, I would say this: if we believe that God created man as a whole being, physical and spiritual, okay, then we must believe that our ministry in some way is going to impact the physical and the spiritual, or to put it another way, the temporal and the eternal, right, aspect of man's existence. It just, to completely ignore the material and say, I'm not here to help anybody with material things, I'm only here to preach the gospel, is to dichotomize man and completely omit. And I just have to ask you, does that make sense? Can you find legitimacy for that in the scriptures? I mean, James, I just quoted James. Now, I know that James is talking about the church, and in Acts 2, when they helped each other, it was a church thing. But But I just can't believe that because that's the way we treat brethren in the church, that, well, we don't treat people outside the church that way. You only get help. I only care about your physical needs once you get saved and come into the church. Really? You see, I just think that we're making an assumption that we can't sustain biblically. That makes sense. But there is the danger of attracting people. So how do you go about that in missions? We talked a little bit after class about that. How do you know if you're a missionary that is considered rich, and you will be if you go to a poor country, you just will be, and don't try to fight it. It's going to happen. I tried to fight it in one ear and out the other, and rightly so. So how do you know when to help somebody materially and when not to? And there is no textbook answer to that question, or if there is, then throw it out of the textbook because it doesn't belong there. There is no easy answer to that question. Missionaries struggle with that when they are in countries that are economically less blessed. And all I can tell you is try to exercise the second great command, love your favorite neighbor as yourself, without offending the first command, loving the Lord your God. Because and sometimes it's just hard to know how to do that. How do you know when you've crossed the line and started attracting somebody for the wrong reason? You can't always avoid it. Okay? It happened to Jesus. It's going to happen to you in ministry sometime. Okay? It's just the way it is. People will come for handouts. All right? And so a lot of prayer, a lot of wisdom. I would say this to you: if you're not sure in a given situation, it's probably better not to help. So what if I lose them? Well, you might lose them. But if the Spirit of God is working on someone, this is where our doctrine of election and the sovereignty of God comes in. You're not going to stand before Jesus someday and hear him say to you, that person died and went in hell because you didn't help him with $50 when he came to you that time. But Lord, I wasn't sure and I didn't want to take, I'm sorry, but he's in hell forever because of that. Nobody goes to hell because you didn't give him a handout or help him out. I'm saying, yeah, Cody?
Okay, so this is kind of unrelated to missions, but there was a church that wanted to start this, I think it was like a food pantry. And they were getting actually supported by another church, but the other church didn't didn't believe in handouts. So they were stuck in between doing the food pantry or losing support.
Mm-hmm.
And I always struggled with that one. I was just like, which one would you do? Because it felt like they had the right mindset with the food pantry, but
yeah. I hesitate to give you an answer to that question because, for one thing, there may be other factors in the scenario that could influence my answer to that question. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, exactly.
I had a colleague in Brazil. I may have told you this before. He refused to give money. The guy came and said, "Do you have some food?" And he helped him, gave him some food, and he watched the guy walk across the street and trade the food for a beer. Drank it down. I mean, there's no guarantee. You really have to, and if there are godly people in the culture you're ministering to, lean on them because they'll often see what you don't. I had Brazilian people just shaking his Mark, Pastor Mark, you really shouldn't be helping that person. All they're doing is taking advantage of you. I hadn't seen it, but they had the wisdom and the courage to tell me. Other times they'd say, well, I think in that situation it's probably, I think that they're probably genuine. Okay, and I would act on that. So but don't kick yourself if you mess up in that. Because we don't see everything and we try to do our best and we try to trust God in that. And that makes sense.
Yeah.
That's all I can say. Yeah, but a lot of missionaries really experience guilt trips because of that. Both sides of the coin. They feel guilty when they help somebody who takes advantage of them. They've used the Lord's money to throw away to some robber, some shyster. Or they feel guilty when they turn somebody away when they have the money to help them. You're going to get hit on both sides of that equation if you're ministering to people in an economically different environment than yours. Is that a hand or just? Okay.
Thinking,
It's not easy, but don't overthink it either. Okay, just try to love people, and you're gonna make your mistakes. Happens with child rearing, happens with teaching, happens with everything. Any other questions or comments about this poverty issue? Did anybody take an article, by the way, that deals with this? I can't remember what article you picked up, but did anybody's article deal with this specifically? Poverty. Okay. All right. Let's just at least jump into the next one then, and incarnationalism and representationalism. Right. Okay. This is when I say the word incarnation, what comes to your mind?
Christ's incarnation.
Okay. Okay. And part of the reason for that is we really don't use that word in everyday English for other things, right? But in the missions world, we do. At least some do, okay? And so this is a big deal. Let's fill in a few, look at these first notes here, a few historical highlights. The social gospel and 2 world wars, okay? The social gospel placed a lot of emphasis on helping people's temporal needs. And so did the wars. What contribution did the 2 world wars make? Well, people started traveling to Europe, and they started seeing what they didn't see before. Nowadays, that's not an issue. People travel all over the globe, right? But before the first 2 world wars, most people didn't get out of their country very much. Now, traveling was a thing for the rich. You know, if you were an overseas seasoned traveler, you were wealthy. But the 2 world wars really started to change that. Not only, and along with those wars came commercial airlines and things, the development more of that type of thing. And so people began to see the poverty. They began to see the difference. And so that had an impact on me. We got to help these people. Man, you should have seen what I saw. The people living in the conditions that they're in and so on. B, Vatican II. Vatican II made a pronouncement about the poor, and I don't have the details of that. All I know is that the decision of the Vatican kind of helped to push the Catholic Church toward helping the poor more, and that also contributed to the idea of liberation theology. Okay. C, the Lausanne Covenant. If you want to put there at the side of letter C, the little phrase deed ministry, D-E-E-D, not dead, but deed ministry. That was a phrase that came out of that Hesselgrave mentions. And so now that doesn't mean that the Lausanne Covenant was trying to completely give itself over to social gospel, but it struggled with the balance. Okay. D, the Manila Manifesto, that was another missions meeting and document that came out of that from the Philippines. And, okay, I'm sorry. Excuse me, I see my mistake here. Deed ministry goes with that one. I beg your pardon. Not the Lausanne Covenant. Okay, deed ministry comes out of the Manila Manifesto. And then adding to that, John Stott's interpretation of John 20:21. As the Father has sent me, so I have sent you. John Stott said, that means that the same things that Jesus did in his ministry, he is sending us to do. And I would take issue with that. I think the main point of Jesus' commission there is, I was sent by the Father, and in turn, I am sending you. He's not commenting on the content of his ministry. All right, now this chart. Just a few minutes here. All right. Incarnationalism is the idea that you and I, as missionaries, as servants of God, are actually fleshing out the person of Jesus when we do his ministry. So you go to work among Islamic people somewhere, okay? You become Jesus to them. So the idea of incarnation is we are actually living out the life of Jesus to these people, right? Now, let me ask you this just real quick. Do you believe that you do that? when you take the gospel to people who don't know Jesus, is there a sense in which you become Jesus to them or not?
Well, in a sense, Paul said, like, for believers, imitate me as I imitate Christ.
Okay.
We also remember that God gave us his spirit to be like the presence of God dwelling and living in us.
Uh-huh.
So in one sense, kind of.
Okay. In what sense? You're right. What is that sense in which we imitate Jesus? The imitators of Jesus, Paul said.
Well, probably not the messianic part,
Right.
but
How would you summarize it? What are we imitating?
his character. Yeah, probably that.
Yep. It's when Paul said that we are becoming conformed to the image of his son, Romans 8, that's the idea. So when Paul says we're to be imitators of Christ, he's not talking about doing the same works that Jesus did or the signs. He's talking about expressing the character, the fruit of the Spirit, right? Okay, but incarnationalism takes it beyond that. Just saying, in missions, incarnationism looks at Jesus as the model missionary, and we do what he did. So signs and wonders and all that stuff becomes a part of their strategy. Over here, representationalism, which is the view that Hesselgrave takes, okay, and I think he's right, Paul becomes the model missionary. Now, I'm not trying to pit Paul against Christ. I mean, Paul said, be imitators of me as I also am of Christ. So there's a certain sense in which the two are compared. But when Hesselgrave says Paul is the model missionary, what does he mean by that? What's he referring to? I mean, yes, he's referring to Paul's character, but is he going beyond that? Is he referring to something else about Paul's ministry that makes him a model for us?
He was human.
Pardon?
He was human.
He was human, okay. And think about his ministry in specific. What about the actual ministry that Paul conducted? In what sense is he the model minister?
In the sense of his methods.
Yeah. But what did Paul do? See, what were his methods? Paul was a church planter. He was an evangelist. He started churches, right? He was carrying out the Great Commission, right? And Hesselgrave would say that Paul serves as the model for how we do ministry. So we are imitators of Jesus in terms of his character. We're becoming like him. But we follow the model of Paul in our missions strategy, methods. What are we actually doing? How do we fulfill the Great Commission? Okay? So it's not an either or proposition, okay? But I would reject the incarnationalism idea as it's defined by many missiologists because it views us as just basically imitating everything about Jesus. And I think that that's off kilter. We're imitating, that's why this is called discontinuity, because we're recognizing the uniqueness of what Christ did, okay? We're dissociating ourselves from the miracles and things like that because they were messianic in nature, okay? And so these are the words that come out of those two positions. Okay, Jesus is going to be the liberator of society. He is going to transfer culture. He's going to save the people. But we are ambassadors, evangelists, church planters in the sense of Paul. So we'll come back to that more later. I just jumped into a little bit this class, but all right. Thank you very much.